Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for November 10th, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by Colin Connor. Welcome, Colin. You're a new member of the family here, coming from DirecTV. Tell us a little about yourself.
Well, thanks, Brian. So I'm the lead for our security incident response and threat analytics team. So happy to be aboard the AT&T family and just looking to continue to build our synergies between our two teams.
All right, very good. And certainly glad to have you here. I guess you're here from Colorado, visiting New Jersey, and looking forward to some discussion here with you today.
Yeah, and ironically that the weather was much warmer in Colorado than it was in New Jersey.
Well, welcome nevertheless. We have Manny Ortiz here. Welcome, Manny.
Thank you.
And John Hogoboom.
How you doing?
Welcome, John. I'm Brian Rexroad, and let's go. Well, first of all, I wanted to just share with you a little bit of an update. Last week we had, I thought, a pretty good discussion with Rick Huber about BGP hijacking, the notion of BGP hijacking, and just by, I think, coincidence, there was what was considered a relatively significant, I'll put it in quotes, hijacking event in India last week. Now, this is an event where a number of address blocks, I think a large number of address blocks, were advertised out of India inadvertently. I think it was basically a mistake that occurred. And so that's one of the things that I guess is, well, does that really constitute a hijacking event, or is it really just an accident of some sort? But it sort of exemplifies the situation that we were describing last week, where if somebody makes a mistake or they have malicious intent, they can start to advertise routes onto the network, which don't necessarily send packets to the places they're supposed to go. Nevertheless, this is one that was published by BGPMon. BGPMon being one of the companies that provides monitoring of a number of the large network service providers for route information to provide alerting services on events. And I think a lot of the events that they detect may actually be intentional activities. One of the things we didn't talk about last week was the fact that large enterprises may be advertising routes onto the internet. They may actually have multiple service providers. In fact, most large enterprises do that, and they may shift traffic around from one ISP to another ISP as a part of their maintenance activities. They may need to do some maintenance on a router, and as Rick had described last week, we do the same thing within the network. And so that's just part of what will show up as so-called events, BGP events, that make it even more difficult to determine which ones are actually malicious or accidental versus those that are actually intentional. So nevertheless, that was just one of the things that was interesting to show up in the news right after having that discussion.
Yeah. And there's like BGP Anycast too, right? Which are like the content distribution networks advertise their routes en masse, more than just like a multi-homed kind of thing. So
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's go to Manny here, and I think we're going to jump onto the theme of ransomware. This has been a growing set of activities here, so why don't you go ahead and tell us what you have here?
Yeah, so the story, that this one's a rather quick one, but as you said, there's sort of a theme today, I think, of ransomware. So we'll hear about a little bit more about some other types of ransomware that have come up recently. So this particular one has a little bit of a new twist to it. Most ransomware, as we know today, will encrypt the files and then obviously ask for the ransom to do the decryption of the files. So in this case, not only do your files get encrypted, but also the file names. So in this case, you're also now, when you go to look at your files, as before, you could look through your directory structure and think there's nothing wrong here. Now it's going to be very apparent that there's something wrong because your file names are now encrypted. So now your files are obviously going to show up with very weird names. So you lose sort of the structure of your files now.
you don't know which ones are the most important ones anymore either.
Exactly.
Right?
So if there was ones that you wanted to particularly go after, let's say to try to recover, you would know at this point which ones to go after. So so it's another sort of scheme to make it a little more enticing for folks to actually pay up the ransom.
Right.
to get their files actually decrypted.
Yeah, the actual impact in that scenario, I mean, I could see that as being more of a psychological impact. Is, you know, I can at least see that there are files there, but now I can't even tell what's
Right,
what.
exactly.
That's-
Or, or what, you know, as John mentioned,
disconcerting.
you know, which files did I have? You know, did I have, were my pictures there, or were my important, you know, presentations there? You know, I have to now remember what was there.
Yeah. So just to sort of, you know, stick the knife in a little bit further, they also decided to do a little bit of mocking as well with this one too. So they actually congratulate you on the message to becoming part of the Cryptowall community, and actually include a hashtag in the hopes that folks will actually go out and start sort of talking on social media about this, again, gaining some more momentum for folks that say, oh man, my files were encrypted, and, you know, and to entice folks to actually pay up and to get their files decrypted again. I think the whole thing with Cryptowall now is, where are we at with Cryptowall in terms of version numbers? They're saying this is 3.0, 4.0. I'm not sure exactly. You know, they're saying this might be the 4.0 version of Cryptowall. I don't know where we're at with it, but obviously Cryptowall has quite a significant impact in terms of how much money they say has actually been brought in because of it. They're saying something like $325 million in damages. So
Wow, that's significant in my opinion.
yeah.
And you know, for that, they should at least send you a little trophy when you enter into the Cryptowall
That's right.
community here.
That's right.
A hat, a coffee mug.
You got your coffee mug, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Colin, I think sort of extending on this theme here, is it Chimera?
Chimera.
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 Now, shame on me. Okay,
Yeah.
so tell us about it.
So Chimera, of course, comes from Greek mythology.
Right.
Ironically, the malicious actors actually displayed the name Chimera trademarked on the ransomware screen. This was published from a report by the Anti-Botnet Advisory Center, or BotFree, and it's been circulating for a few weeks and targeting specifically targeting companies in Germany. And actually is all, the ransomware is all, the message is all in German. That the initial delivery is through email, and specifically through job applications or business offers. So targeting specific types of people. The ransomware, not much different than other ransomware, similar Cryptowall, delivered via, this one actually is specifically a Dropbox link. So I think we see a lot of the Cryptowall that may be some random URL. This was specifically on Dropbox and infects the user. Of course, encrypts local files and network shares. Ransomware is once again in Bitcoin, about actually $685 is what's being reported as the equivalent in Bitcoins. And so the unique part of this, besides the name, if you're a malicious threat actor, you have to come up with a cool name for your malware, right? But the unique part here is that it actually threatens to post documents, pictures, etc. on the internet. So that the BotFree did not find any evidence of posting the files, but this definitely is a change of methodology as well as scare tactics that Manny was referring to. That, hey, we have your data and we're going to post it, and your sensitive documents from a business corporation, now I have to protect even more. Or my pictures or whatever else may be sensitive to me is now out there, and I'm going to $685. I'm going to pay that because it's worth it to me.
Yeah, but of course we don't really recommend that. I mean, what you really should be doing is just trying to protect against these types of attacks.
Correct.
Being prepared or expecting this sort of thing. But, I think, one of the things that you had pointed out is there's no evidence that they're actually stealing the files for posting purposes or other sorts of threats, but they are making that threat. And, that's one of the things that most victims probably have no idea whether they actually have the files or not.
Correct.
And so that's one of the, I guess, the challenges here. You don't really know if it's been taken. You basically do know that somebody has hold of your computer and has some level of control of it.
Right, and if they can start mimicking what Cryptowall does by encrypting the file names. Now you don't even know what your file names of what could have been posted. So, I mean, the thoughts that you can run in your mind can be just crazy.
Now, one of the things you just sort of, I think, kind of, I'll say glossed over was the fact that they're using Dropbox. And, I think that's, Dropbox is a cloud service for being able to share files with peers. And I think it kind of points out just one of these aspects of cloud services that perhaps is a little bit underappreciated. That is, organizations, and this is true with Facebook and Twitter and others, that they end up having to get into a position where they're analyzing the data that's posted for malicious content so that their reputation of their service doesn't get eroded.
Right.
And that's a very important aspect of this, and the fact that, hopefully that once Dropbox was, sort of got cognizance of this activity, was able to do something to deter that type of file sharing.
Right, and Dropbox is definitely an important point on this as well, that you may, it wouldn't be uncommon for users to exchange data via Dropbox. So the business offers, I hover the link, it's the same. Okay, I'm going to click on it, and in this case, actually, when you click on the link, it actually infects you. There's no additional execution; it automatically infects and then encrypts the local system.
Okay. Now, we were wondering a little bit earlier whether the threat to publish files was actually a feature they're advertising before it's available. The marketing always comes out before the actual features, so
right.
We'll have to see if that development comes along in the next version.
They're testing the market to see whether we're scared enough.
Hey, if it's if just the threat's working enough, that may be enough for them. But
one thing's
we'll
for
see how
sure,
it
though, if you had a choice of which ransomware to actually get, mine would be better.
Yours would be better.
It's cheaper.
It's
so,
cheap.
yeah,
it's cheaper. Okay.
Oh, you can buy. Oh, to get the keys. Yeah, but we're not advocating that.
All right. So, Manny, tell us about this third one here.
So again, sticking with the theme, right? So this is another new wrinkle to the whole ransomware. So again, just like any other ransomware, this one seems to be Russian-based. The payment on this one is 20,000 Russian ruble. I think I said that right. Was it ruble?
Don't ask me. It
All
stands
right.
for it. But yeah,
That's right.
you're right.
It looks like, in this particular case, this was Checkpoint actually doing a little bit of analysis on this latest sample. It looks like it's been around for about a year. So now that they've looked back and they've seen that it's been around for about that long. And like the other ransomware, this one also puts up a splash screen, replaces your wallpaper with a Russian message. When it's translated, it says your files are encrypted. If you wish to retrieve them, send one encrypted file to the following mail address. And they've obviously used a ton of different mail addresses that are actually listed in the story. And you have 1 week to email me, after which the decryption will become impossible. And then again, the piece that becomes a little more unusual about this one is that normally what we know is that with the encryption, the way that it happens is once you are infected, what happens is your box reaches out and to retrieve the actual key, right? So that piece of it is missing here. So with that piece being missing, there's that piece that you now cannot, it's harder to stop this from happening. So before, you were able to, if you understand where the command and control is, you could put a block in place. Now, once you're infected, that's it. Your files are already encrypted. So there's a file format, so it's quite unusual, again, that it actually encrypts your files. So once it encrypts the files, it uses this format that you can see there. It's the email address is included so it's changing every single file to include the email address, the internal version number, the machine identifier, the date and time, and some random digits. So it's completely, completely changed all your files over to this. So again, it's now not reaching out to get that key. Basically, the way that it works is that it takes the first 30,000 bytes and it encrypts it using 2 buffers of random digits and letters, and it takes the original byte and it randomly performs a math operation on them. So it takes the original byte and the random piece of it. The remainder of that file, so if the file's over 30,000 bytes, if there's not, then obviously the second part doesn't matter. But if the file is larger than 30,000 bytes, it takes the remainder and it's encrypted using an RSA locally generated public key and a matching local private key. And then basically the third part of this is so you've got this encryption layer, and then on top of that, it takes all of that so far, and now it also adds another. The buffers and the private keys that it's already created, it adds metadata to each file and then encrypts that using 3 hard-coded RSA private keys. RSA 768 public keys, and then the matching RSA private keys are located on the attacker side. So once the attacker gets
essentially, they're encrypting it with a random key, the file, on the machine locally. And then that metadata of those keys is encrypted with some static keys buried into each file.
Exactly.
And then you would have to know the private static keys back up on the attacker side to
attacker
decode
has,
the metadata that could uncode your file.
Exactly.
So it's like 2 layers of encryption.
And what I'm hearing here is that besides the delivery of the malware, there's no additional infrastructure that's needed by the threat actor, by the malicious party.
Right.
That's correct.
That all the encryption is happening locally, and they're just using email as a communication method as opposed to a website or whatever the case may be.
Yep. Yeah.
So let's take a quick, actually I feel pretty safe myself because I have an old computer and it would take it weeks to do this. But nevertheless, I think some of us have more modern computers, and so let's take a little bit of a look at how we should be protecting ourselves. The first one, obviously you want to have a good backup of your data. But consider the layers of security that you want to have just to prevent getting the malware in the first place. I think, Colin, and a lot of these are basically sent through some email path. And so you want to have a good email filtering solution in place to be able to hopefully not let those into your enterprise in the first place. Or if you're using an email service as a consumer, same kind of thing. Make sure you're using a service where you're not getting a lot of garbage mail. That's a pretty good indication. If you're getting a lot of garbage email, then the bad stuff's more likely to leak through as well. But then as a user, just looking at your email, if it doesn't look right, don't open it.
Right? Good user education.
Good user education
within your company,
practices, right?
and let people know what to look
for. So a reminder, we've had Murray on the program here, our little mascot associated with our own internal awareness program. He can help with these kinds of things. I think there are a few samples of Murray's videos on the internet available for folks to take a look at. And then next one would be, you want to make sure your antivirus is up to date on the computer itself. So if it doesn't get infected, hopefully the antivirus solution is up to date on being able to protect against that. Now, generally, the next layer, the fifth, that us as analysts tend to look for is that command and control activity. So this is a case where that may not be available to us. So we're going to need to look for other ways to be able to pick up on this type of activity. But at least you have the first 4 layers that we described, and not to mention actually having a decent backup. So basically 5 layers of protection here. This really we shouldn't have too many victims of this type of thing if we're protected well, or at least be able to recover from it. Okay, so let's shift topics
gears.
a little bit. Shift
Away
gears,
from ransomware.
literally. Let's get into some gears. And the pedal to the metal and speeding tickets.
Well, don't speed too fast because you're being video recorded. So this is a story actually comes out from Electronic Frontier Foundation. They kind of reported on this. They started investigating these systems. Actually, Shodan, who we've talked about on the show before, is a kind of a scanning. They're kind of a public scanning source. They go out there and scan the internet for different types of things on different ports. And they started indexing these devices, and they discovered that what these are automated license plate readers. So initially they thought, oh, these are just traffic cameras when they would log into, like, is there public open to the internet? They would go check it out and say, oh, look, it's like a traffic camera. You can see things. But then they started to realize, wait a second, I'm seeing the license plate show up next to, as it's capturing people's cars and zipping by. So what these are used by law enforcement. They deploy these around cities or municipal areas and whatnot. And more often than not, they are configured, besides being open, they found a large population of these being open to the internet and at large. Normally, their kind of default configuration is that they aren't just recording cars that are on maybe a hot list or something. They're recording every car that goes by and the license plate, and they just store that off. And they might record that for a year or more, so that if a car ends up on a hot list at some point, they can go back and look in the history of where has this car been seen and what times of day, in case they need to try to find it, you know what I mean? Or the patterns that it might follow.
Where's the last been seen, right?
So that's what the system does, is it stores that time and date information and whatnot. It's one of these, this is kind of just another story. We've talked about other maybe less interesting devices out on the internet that have been just, people put them up there, they don't realize that they're exposing a web or a telnet port. That's what these expose more often than not, is a web and a telnet port that you could log into with a default password. But it's just another one of those Internet of Things type devices that people aren't aware of. Fortunately, after being, they did kind of discover that there are two large populations of these, kind of clustered. Cluster in California and other cluster in Louisiana, related to certain organizations. They did contact them, and they've since secured those. But there's probably a few others out there scattered around related to having these deployed in various areas. So it's one of those things, when you put these kinds of devices out there, you really should understand what ports are exposed, and whether they really need to be internet facing at all.
Right, absolutely. I mean, the internet is a convenient interconnection solution.
Right.
So long as the internet is facilitating that, but it probably would be good. I mean, if you're going to connect something to the internet, you need to make sure that that device is prepared to be connected to the internet. Otherwise, you really need some good network protection solutions around that.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah, you need to assume that the barbarians are at the gate. As soon as you put a device on the internet, assume that you're going to have a horde of bad guys trying to break into it. People who don't, expect that, or even have the concept that that's the case, are fooling themselves, because that's what happens day in and day out. We see it all the time. The amount of scanning that goes on.
So you mentioned Shodan at the beginning, and it just it's sort of a mention that FBI recently came out with a public information notice indicating that advanced attackers are using Shodan to help identify vulnerable systems for exploit.
Right.
Now, wow, what a surprise!
Right? Like, who wouldn't? It's a handy
I think
index.
it's sort of important, and Shodan being one of the available tools, but certainly any service or system that's able to, collecting information about vulnerabilities or exposed systems and posted is going to, be facilitated by attackers. I mean, even ones that aren't necessarily publicly available. Shodan has some publicly available capabilities. They have an enterprise licensing model, so you can basically buy the entire collection of data. There are some other services out there that have free information based on their scanning activity. But even other ones that might not have public information, they are potentially subject to exploit, right? So that information may not be available to us publicly, but to an attacker may in fact be. So I think that's it's important to consider that as you pointed out, John, anything that's connected to the network, even if the attackers don't discover it right away, there may be others that will discover it, and that information be made basically available, so that the attackers don't really have to do reconnaissance. All they have to do is come in and do the attack.
Right. Even websites. I mean, something as simple as having your website online, running a particular version of software, gets indexed by Google. And there's a lot of tricks you can use with Google to find certain vulnerable versions of software out there. Barring Shodan and the advanced capabilities that it provides, there's a lot of simple things for finding just vulnerable versions of Joomla or WordPress or a lot of these other things.
The web exploits that that may exist. So that information basically gets indexed. It makes it easier for
bad
attackers
guys.
to find avenues in. And
So you should use that yourself to assess your own
absolutely.
vulnerabilities on your own networks.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, that might be a worthwhile segment for us to do sometime in the future to just show a few examples of how that that can be done. We'll have to do a little masking, I guess.
Yeah, probably.
All right, Colin, let's go back to you here. And key farce, tell us a little bit about that.
So while it might sound like a superhero or an anime character, this is no joke. So this was code and a corresponding binary that was released by Security Assessment at the ISIG conference in Auckland, New Zealand. So this, key farce is a play on the name of KeyPass. So it steals credentials stored in KeyPass. Of course, KeyPass is a local password manager designed to protect credentials locally on the system. It allows you to have much more complex passwords, passwords for specific websites. You can just go wild with passwords. It also, KeyPass has process memory protection, so that applications can't steal the passwords that are in memory, and of course encrypts the data at rest. So this piece of code, this piece of software actually uses what's called DLL injection. So this is Windows-based. And so it's injecting into the DLL some set of C# commands to execute what's already built into the KeyPass database, so doing an export. The key here is that while this is a research, this code can be used, and the method can be used across not just KeyPass, but other key repository solutions. But it has to have the computer has to actually be compromised. The system has to be compromised.
Right.
Somebody has to be on the box and put this code on there. And then with KeyPass, that it actually so if you do not have the database open, it's encrypted, and you're not interacting with the application. So the application has to be running, the database has to be unlocked. So this is definitely a different change to defense. That a lot of times it's been keyloggers in the past that have recorded this information. Now the threat actors are actually trying to get to your whole key store and trying to really catch up with technology a little bit. And my recommendation is we need to actually step back in technology and start going back to the past phrases. Remembering having phrases that we summarize into words and characters, and then modify per websites, so that you're going back to the human being the database repository, the credential repository, as opposed to technology.
Yeah. Well, I have a little bit of a different opinion, and we talked about this a little bit before. First of all, if you really want to do this right, I think it's go hardware or go home.
That's right.
I mean, you really have to have some piece of separation that separates the authentication method. I'm going to generalize it to authentication method. We're talking about passwords here, and fundamentally, passwords are flawed. I mean, they really need to kind of go away. The notion of two-factor authentication, to have something but not be dependent on that, and have some device. I love the tokens. A lot of the hardware tokens that are used for two-factor authentication are kind of moving into software tools, and I think they're the same kinds of hazards that they're going to be susceptible to here. That is, if you can see it on the screen, somebody can capture it. So I think this is a case where we really need to think about trying to get some things into hardware a little bit better. And in fact, I think there have been a couple of attempts to do this on actually mobile devices.
Right.
That opportunity still exists to do it much better than has been done so far. And I think the opportunity to really make it mainstream may be coming. So.
Right. And definitely the key here is that the computer is compromised. So if you have your secure your two-factor authentication on the same system, then the chances of it being compromised as well are there.
Right. And just as a side note, I think the tendency has been to think about like an SMS back channel, message as a form of two-factor authentication. It is, but it isn't. I mean, that there are weaknesses associated with that. There's no guarantee that an SMS message is going to a specific device. There are other ways of accessing SMS messages, and if that's been hacked, then you have a problem there. Somebody's account may have been have unauthorized access to it or something along those lines. So again, I think you really need to really do this right. I think we need to go hardware. And but in the meantime, certainly users, if they want to be protecting themselves against this type of attack, I think using the passphrase tricks and things that you can remember will be helpful.
Yeah.
Of course, you always have the notion of a sticky note in your wallet or something like that, right?
Yeah.
On your keyboard.
Yeah, nobody goes to your desk anymore, right?
Keep it in your wallet. Keep it in your wallet. All right, thanks for bringing that. And John, let's go back to you. And so I get confused about the anti-ad. You're going to have to explain.
Yeah, this is a kind of weird one. So PageFair, I guess, is a company that kind of, so we've talked about advertisement networks. You go to a web page, and it displays maybe in the corner a side panel, an advertisement for a company. And sometimes those are tailored to you because they have some tracking cookies and they figure out, oh, you're interested in these companies, and they'll present that or whatnot. So from my understanding, PageFair is a company that does a similar thing, but is really just tracking when those advertisements are blocked, maybe by a browser or whatnot, or some other intermediary preventing the users from seeing the ads. And it's something that if you're in the business of having your ads being presented to people on websites, you'd want to know whether you're being blocked or not. Right. That's really not the crux of the story here, though. The real crux of the story is that PageFair, which is very similar to an advertising network company, let's just leave it at that for this context, they were spearphished by an attacker with an email. And from that, they were able to get access to a key email address that was used to register the account on their content distribution network that they use for all of their advertising stuff that they manage. So the bad guy, they forced a password reset on the content distribution network so that they were able to get into the content distribution network where they host their content. They swapped out the JavaScript for the PageFair, the legitimate PageFair JavaScript, with their own malicious JavaScript. And what that did is deliver, when someone went to one of these websites where PageFair is participating and it's presenting ads and whatnot, or is in the loop there, they would get a little pop-up that says, hey, your Adobe Flash is out of date. You need to update it, which we've seen that before, as a ruse. Ultimately, what would happen is if the user was tricked into clicking it, they would get the nanocore rat, which I'm not familiar with nanocore. I probably need to look up a little bit more on that one, but I guess another one of those remote access Trojans that, there's tons of them out there. But that's what this one was dropping on the user's machine. So just another example of when you have a website and you want to integrate advertisement networks and whatnot into it, that not all the content on your, it can affect your reputation of your website when you integrate third-party content into your pages. And that's what happened, here. So they had some reputational situation by the people who were, PageFair was integrating with and whatnot.
Right. So, if you take this right on the surface, the inclination is to trust no one.
Right. Wow.
Yeah. But you have to trust. You have to trust certain things, and so be a little bit controlled about what you do. I mean, it's just like roaming the streets, right? The only protection I can think of here, as an individual, is to just be deliberate about what you're doing, where you visit, and have it be purpose specific. If you're just browsing around aimlessly, the likelihood of having problems show up are going to increase.
I mean, the problem with this, and it's quite apparent, is that's good. You can obviously the sites that are you think are legitimate sites. The sites that I visit, it's a place where I get my news and I get my email and stuff. The problem is like John said, you've got these third-party content delivery, and so if that site gets compromised like this, then going to wallstreetjournal.com, if you're presented with the ad, you're still
it's still a possibility. But I guess what I was referring to is if you're more direct or limited in where you go, and certainly Wall Street Journal and reputable organizations are going to be paying attention to things like this. If they start getting complaints, they're going to start doing something about it. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. The reputation point that you made earlier, John, that is, this got detected. reputation started to erode, and so they had to
Right,
go.
so they
That was
took action.
perhaps helped the discovery process and took action around that.
And
So
PageFair
that's
themselves
interesting.
have a nice blog article describing why this will never happen again to them. They've
Good.
instituted a lot of additional security
Some additional
and
controls.
protection on controls of the keys and email accounts that control these various relationships that they have. And we've talked about this before with other types of things. You know, the SEA, Syrian Electronic Army, is that what it is?
Yeah.
They had done similar types of tactics
Right.
where they would get
Use the password reset process.
the
as a
password
means to
reset
gain
process on a
access,
hacked
right.
account in order to post something as though they were that legitimate company. I can't remember what it was, but it was another news agency. I can't
Yeah,
remember.
well,
which
I
one.
think Brian Krebs had posted an article on this, or actually I think it was in the addendum of his book, Spam Nation, around the notion of, pay very close attention to the access control to your email accounts, because that is the path to password resets in
Yep.
most cases. Your strength of your passwords on individual sites is only as good as basically the password reset process that's behind it. Most often it's, you request a password reset off the site, sends you an email, gives you the link, you go to the link. That's the trick.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
I mean, for the end user, once they go try to log in again, they might notice that they can't figure out what their password is, but that's that's a little late at that point.
Yeah, so I think on this, one of the things to remember is that even when you're prompted for a Java update or Adobe update, that don't go by the pop-up. Go to the official sites.
Good point. Yes.
With Java or Adobe or whatever the case may be, and download that plug-in, that software.
Yeah, make sure you're getting it from the legitimate site. Good point. Okay, let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. We talked a little bit about the Akamai report, State of the Internet report. They talked about 3 new attack vectors that they're observing, and this is one of them that is, relatively new from my point of view. Wanted to share this with you on the activity and how it's progressing here. Starting around September 25th timeframe, we started to see some increases in traffic on port 137 UDP. This is NetBIOS name server. It does appear to be reflective denial of service attacks on this port, upwards in the sort of hundreds of megabits per second in some of these cases, very spiky in nature. But most of the targets we see in these attacks are basically consumer address targets. And I would say that's indicative of being used by booter services. And what I mean by that is, these commercial denial of service attacks services that you can basically pay them, they'll do the attack for you. You don't, individually build the botnet to support that. Considering the frequency here is relatively low, I'm going to guess that basically one organization or one of the booter services is using this function at this point. But we can probably anticipate there will be some increases in the not too distant future.
But again, know what you're exposed to on the internet, because this is not necessarily the booter service's fault.
This is
people
Windows
who have
machines being
devices, Windows machines that are exposed to the internet.
Without any
why
firewall
anybody in
front
the
end.
world would have NetBIOS name service up to the internet is beyond me. But there are enough of them out there that they can be used for reflection.
That's right. Next item here are the top 10 most probed ports, and port 23 TCP on the top here, that's Telnet, followed by port 22 TCP, that's moved up a few spots, followed by ICMP 8, that's ping request. I usually don't report on the ICMP things, partly because it is such a variety of activities here. This being an echo request, a lot of times what they're doing is probing around to see what systems will respond to a ping, and then they may do some other port scanning on the device afterward. But that's moved up a little bit. I actually looked at the graph. It hasn't changed significantly here, so I'm not exactly sure why that moved up. It may have been some other things moved down to drive that moving up. Port 445 TCP, followed by port 80 TCP, 443 TCP, so scanning for the web interfaces. And the 445, by the way, again, Windows devices exposed to the internet. That's the file sharing feature. If there aren't good passwords in the Windows machine exposed to the internet, it basically can give access to the file system. So. Anyway, the next item here, 1900 UDP, that went down a few slots this week. We'll take a quick look at that and see what the profile looks like. Followed by 21320 TCP. Actually, I don't know what that port is.
I was going to ask you.
I better go and look it up, and we'll post something here. Followed by 1433 TCP. We're going to take a little closer look at that one. That moved up 6 slots, and then followed by 3389. That's a remote desktop protocol. So looking at port 23 TCP, this is looking at 90 days of activity here, and as you can see, we had another surge of activity within the last week here, I guess since about November 6th when that bumped up again. So what was that? That was just over the weekend. You know, somebody was I was chatting with somebody today. We're getting into the holiday period, and this just kind of, you know, forgive the tangent here, but we were talking about how we used to see a real big surge in activity around the holiday periods as, you know, the schools were out, you know, whether it be high schools or colleges, colleges breaks, and so we'd see a surge in the hacking activity. And, you know, we were kind of looking for ways to get rid of that noise so that we could see the more advanced stuff and be able to focus on those activities. It's kind of the other way around now. When the breaks come, it doesn't really create that big of a surge because there's so much organized criminal activity that hides all of the, you know, I'll say hobbyists. So unfortunately, it's become more of a career activity than a hobby. Nevertheless, we do see a surge in the telnet activity there. We're going to take a look at the IP address profile in a little bit as well. In terms of scan probes on port 1900 UDP, this is SSDP, mostly associated with reflective denial of service attacks, and we see a little bit of a drop off here. There's a possibility that there's a shift between using 1900 UDP to perhaps some of these other vectors that are, I won't say up and coming, but perhaps more effective than 1900 is at this point, because some folks have been putting some blocks into place. But nevertheless, what we are seeing is mostly reflective denial of service attack activity, and several of the addresses look like they are potential targets. That is, you know, in this perspective, the sources of the scanning activity may in fact be targets of attack. Looking at scan probes on port 1433 TCP, that's Microsoft SQL database, what we see is that there's actually been a drop-off in that activity. We had a relatively large surge around between the end of August and into the to the end of October here, kind of dropped off there. But most of the probes here are actually from just 3 Chinese sources that are remaining that we see on the activity list here. Looking at the most sources doing the probing, port 23 really taking up a big piece of the pie here, about half of it. You know, they should really share. And more notably, I think we had a big jump in port 8080 activity. It jumped up a number of points here. But nevertheless, port 23 followed by 445 TCP. We see 80 TCP that jumped up a piece, and 8080 TCP had jumped up as well. So let's take a little closer look at port 23. As we reported last week, we're looking at the last 180 days of activity here, and we still see that sort of upward trend in terms of the number of sources that are doing probing on port 23. So again, looking for these devices that are connected to the internet, exposing telnet. You really shouldn't be using telnet, especially on the internet in any case these days. Looking at these scan sources on port 80 TCP, that's HTTP, we see it's really spiky activity and some significant jumps here in terms of the number of sources. Typically, we see maybe about 2,000 sources scanning on port 80. It jumped up around, well, we peaked out on the 6th at about 15,000 sources probing on that. And it's very diverse sources. They're kind of all over the map. I mean, geographically and in terms of the types. And similarly, on port 8080 TCP, sort of an alternate port for web, again, very diverse sources. We see a higher proportion of the probes from China here, but very similar profile, a peak of about 9,000 sources in one case here. Now, if we have the same sources that are probing on port 80 and port 8080, considering the profiles here, there are some aspects of the algorithm that might, you know, port 8080 being a higher port, it might actually have the same numbers, but might register slightly lower here. It's a matter of interpretation whether it's actually scanning activity or not. So it's a figment of the basically the algorithm. So with that, that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at AT&T ThreatTraq@list.att.com. And you can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel It's on YouTube as well as on iTunes, the iTunes obviously being an audio version of it. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. And I'd like to thank you, Colin. Thank you, Manny. Thank you, John. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.